Hi, it's Liz, and I am, you know, making a video here, as you might have noticed. Um, and today I wanted to talk about adult meltdowns, my adult meltdowns, and I've been thinking about talking about this for a really long time. It's really vulnerable for me, because as other autistic adults will tell you, and as you might be able to figure out if you can just imagine for a moment, being an adult and having anything that's called a meltdown, or that somebody else might refer to as a tantrum or something like that, is embarrassing. Um, and more than that, especially since, I have an actual child of my own, I have a toddler. It brings about like great feelings of guilt, you know. Um, it makes me feel unfit, and so that's hard. I mean, I feel like it's my duty to try to model emotional regulation for her, and I can't always do that. So that sucks. Um, Although that's probably not the best way of framing it, actually, because it's not. It definitely is about regulation, and it definitely does sort of manifest in an emotional way. But I mean, I want to talk a little bit for starters about where it's coming from and why it happens. Because, I mean, don't get me wrong, like any person, sometimes I get very emotional, and sometimes my emotions propel me to extreme behaviors or they get out of control. Sometimes I just get so angry I can't deal with it, that kind of thing. Or I get so sad I become irrational, whatever. That happens to everyone, I think, or to most of us who maybe don't um, have perfect emotional regulation all the time. Uh, However, this is not really that, and I think that's a key thing. Um, so the way I would frame it, the way I would model it is that meltdowns, uh, like a lot of other autistic behavior that winds up being problematized, and winds up sort of concerning or disturbing people. It happens because we're overwhelmed. That's the key, that's the core thing. And being overwhelmed can spill over into an emotional experience, for sure. Like, I mean, sometimes if I'm getting so overwhelmed that I'm on the verge of melting down, I do start to feel angry. And it kind of manifests as anger. But anger is not the source of this. This isn't starting because I'm angry about something. It's starting because I'm more and more overwhelmed. The things that are overwhelming for me and for a lot of other autistic people. One of the big things is sensory overwhelm. Um, so, and the thing about this too is it, at a certain point, there's sort of a multiplicative effect of various sensory inputs piling onto each other. So, it might start out that I am getting overwhelmed by touch, and this happens a lot for me having a toddler, because toddlers have this tendency to want to touch these sensitive parts of your skin, really quickly, really softly, in this way that's almost like tickling, but but not quite. And not stop and want to touch you constantly and, you know, crawl all over you and that kind of thing. Um, and that can be very overwhelming. That triggers my tactile overwhelm. And once that happens, then suddenly I feel even more sensitive. Suddenly, um, something I hadn't noticed before about my outfit is bothering me. You know, suddenly, well, and I guess I have this problem at other times too, but it gets more intense where suddenly I feel just intensely distressed by walking around on the floor and having there be any little piece of dirt or anything that I'm stepping on, let alone something that might be in my way or something I might um walk into or brush past. Those kinds of things starts to really snowball into this thing where every time I have a tactile sensation that is not that is intense to me, or not what I'm expecting, or uncomfortable, that, you know, on the level of things that normally wouldn't really register to me um, as being a big issue at all, uh, it just becomes more and more and more. Um, and that can easily pile on to other senses, you know. Suddenly, I can't stand any kind of sound. Suddenly, visual clutter is distressing to me. And I'm not just talking about not liking it, you know, or finding it aesthetically displeasing. It's more like it sends me into a panic. Um, a panic that is paralyzing because it's so it's so overwhelming. Like, I just feel like I need to go hide from it. I need to recover before I can do anything about it, before I can sort of process my way through it and, you know, do whatever it needs to do, organize something, or, you know, move something gracefully out of the way. um, it becomes more and more like a fight or flight kind of response. So I can't really just rationally approach the stimuli and change my environment the way I would normally, right? Um, so, and then, you know, suddenly too, it'll be like I'm more sensitive to light than I normally would be, which I'm usually kind of pretty sensitive to light. Well, I don't know. It depends on your, uh, it's all relative, I guess. I'm normally more sensitive to light than most people, but if I start getting into this kind of hypersensitivity mode, then it becomes suddenly really intense. And it's not just that it's a little too much for me, it's that it's starting to send me into a rage because it's like assaulting my senses, you know? Um, this can happen with every sense too, you know, for me, you know. And also, an issue with a toddler is they make a lot of noises, and it's not so much at a certain point with the overwhelm too, it's not necessarily the intensity of each stimuli, but it's the fact that they won't stop that can really drive you to a point of meltdown. And that's difficult with a child because if they're wound up, they might not stop, you know, yelling at your name and touching you and that kind of thing, right? Um, so, I mean, the thing for me that I've been working on with uh, a fair bit of success is managing to recognize when I'm starting to shift into this territory and making a change while I can in what's going on. Just sort of I mean, it depends on the situation what exactly that means. It might mean um, going to a different room for a while, making sure she's safe, but going to a different room just for a moment, putting on a movie, you know, and leaving the room for a second until I can calm down. That kind of thing. It can be a lifesaver because I really don't want to get to the point where I'm having a meltdown. And when that happens, I mean, it goes further and further to this point that is irrational and very panicky and possibly angry. And once you start getting really close to there, it's difficult at that point on your own to disrupt the process and keep it from going into a full-blown meltdown because you're not operating rationally at that point. The best that I can really do at that point is to try not to expose, the people around me, and in this case, a child, to a full-blown meltdown. So managing to just get into another room long enough so I can have my meltdown. And for me, the meltdowns that I have had as an adult have not been as long and as serious, I think, as some autistic adults that I've heard from about this. For me, it's generally pretty quickly. There might be what you call mini meltdowns, because mostly it's like I'll scream at the top of my lungs, and it's hard to explain. There are times when I can sort of choose to do this. There's a level of choice where I'm like, I'm reaching the brink. I just want to get this over with and release this feeling because it's going to come out one way or another. And so I scream, and maybe I hit something, and then I have this period of feeling very weird, very like detached and peaceful. And then I can kind of start repairing the damage. Sometimes it's worse though. I have had one probably about a year ago, I guess, at this point. And this was very much before I had any kind of like strategy for preventing this or dealing with it. But I had one where I completely broke down, and I was harming myself. I was bashing my head into something, and might have given myself a mild concussion. And it was it was similar in a lot of ways, in that I had a similar feeling of being sort of exhausted but peaceful and detached afterwards, but that lasted a lot longer. It was just way more intense. Yeah, after that I started trying to come up with some strategies, because you got to understand that, like, I do sort of remember having meltdowns as like a little kid. I would hyperventilate a lot, and I would go into that kind of a space, but I stopped, and as I got to be an older kid and a teenager, I would have shutdowns, which is a similar kind of thing. It is a response to overwhelm, but instead of lashing out and doing something sort of loud and destructive and that kind of thing, it's like you just For me, it would be like I could feel almost like the gears of my mind sort of slowing to the point where I couldn't process language anymore. So I couldn't really understand what people were saying, or nor could I speak back to them. Um, and that would happen pretty regularly as I was a teenager. But this kind of meltdown that I'm experiencing now is really specific, I think, to just where I'm at and my circumstances in life. This is, I've never been the mother of a toddler before. I stay at home. I found this to be very stressful for me. It does not play to my strengths as a person. So as a result, I have this new challenge that has not really been the issue for me. And I was going to say too, there's also this thing that can happen where I don't see it coming still. I mean, I've gotten better at being able to see it coming, but sometimes I kind of tell myself, no, like, I've got this, I'm dealing with this, I know all the tricks. I know how to meditate. I know about mindfulness. I know all the things that, well-meaning neurotypicals would want to tell me that I should do. And sometimes I can keep myself from getting to that point that way. But sometimes it's more sort of like tricking myself. Like I'll feel like, okay, I'm managing this. I'm accepting the stimuli. I'm accepting what's going on and all the stuff that I'm trying to process. I'm accepting the chaos. And then suddenly, before I even really know what happened, I just kind of hear myself scream. And that would be like a very mini meltdown, right? That's not a full-blown, like, on the floor in a fetal position, but it is, it's distressing to people. I understand this. I don't want this. I don't want to subject people to this. And, especially for a kid, it's hard for people to understand that you're not necessarily angry at them. That's not really about anger. And it's not really about it being other people's fault. It's just that the situation, whatever it is about the circumstance, is too overwhelming for me to process, and it got to a crisis point. That is what happened. And I think that's where there's a communication breakdown between people on the spectrum and people who aren't, because, like, my channel is named after theory of mind, and a lot of, like, failure of sort of higher, like, levels of theory of mind comes down to people. We look at each other's behavior and we say, well, if I was going to do that, then that would mean that I was feeling this way, or my intentions were this, or whatever. And I think this is like a level that people who are not on the spectrum are very unlikely to be able to relate to this. So they assume it's an emotional outburst, primarily, not an outburst that's really based on cognitive overload that might sort of manifest in a somewhat emotional way, right? Like, there's a distinction. I hope that that's an understandable distinction for you, because it's really, like, again, I do know what it's like to be overloaded with emotion, right? I do know what it's like to be to grieve so much that I can't control myself, or to be so filled with rage that I can't control myself. I do know what that feels like, and it's different. It's truly different. But I can see how it might look similar from the outside. One of the things that my husband has noticed about me is when I have those, like, mini meltdowns, like I'm saying, where I just suddenly scream, Like he sees how it is because, you know, a lot of the time it'll be like I'm just doing something, I'm doing something quietly. I'm keeping my experience to myself. Suddenly I scream and then I go right back to what I was doing because I released that tension by screaming. I wasn't screaming to communicate something to someone. It wasn't something I was doing to be. It's not because I was emotionally upset, because I was not. I just was overwhelmed. And sometimes too, I should say I didn't structure this well. The overwhelm isn't necessarily sensory. It can also come from other kinds of cognitive overload. For example, I'm trying to do something and there's something about it that's frustrating in a repeated way where I'm trying to do it, it's not working over and over again. It keeps being frustrating in the same way, or there's, especially then there might be something that's touching me awkwardly and that's adds to the overload. It might be that a number of different people are trying to talk to me at the same time, or I'm thinking deeply about something when I'm interrupted, or trying to problem solve when there's also sensory input that I can't do both at the same time, but maybe the problem solving is kind of like time sensitive, like I need to be doing it right now, and being interrupted in a cognitive process is also something that is like nails on a chalkboard to somebody on the spectrum. And sometimes we just can't do it. It's not just that it's unpleasant, it's like it's hard to explain. It's painful, and it's not always possible for us to actually transition from a thought process we're having to something else. And I again, this is another thing that I feel like a lot of people who are not on the spectrum kind of choose to interpret it, or they just do interpret it in this way that's like, oh, they just don't like being interrupted. And it's like, nobody likes being interrupted. It's like, it's not really about liking or disliking exactly. It's about what is like possible for us, and what is like searingly painful, and just how we work, I mean, a lot of autistic people, and this is definitely a trait I have, like if I'm thinking about something hard enough and you talk to me, there is a fairly high chance that I will just not even hear you. Even if you're completely audible, you're yelling at me, you're right next to me, it doesn't matter, because I'm thinking about something. I can only do one thing at a time. Like truly. And when somebody does manage to rip us out of a deep thought process, it's like it contributes to overwhelm. That's a nice way to put it. Okay, anyway, this video is too long now. I hope this gives you some perspective. I know I can't speak for everybody, but this has been my experience with this. It sucks. Just I guess as a final thought, I'd to say that, and this is true for autistic children as well. It's just true for people on the spectrum. The best cure for a meltdown is prevention. And it's just not something you can really treat as a disciplinary issue, because it's not a behavior choice. It's more like a volcano erupting inside of you. And most of us, especially adults, already feel guilty enough without somebody trying to make us feel worse about it. What we need is to recover and to figure out how we can restructure what's going on so that we don't get to that point. That's the work. So, on that note, I'll see you all pretty soon because I'm going to make a bunch of videos this weekend. So, okay, bye.